So I'll leave it at that.
Mr Chairman.
The Honourable Peter Dunne.
Mr Chairman, I will take a call to deal with some of the issues that have been raised to date. My starting point is to just observe that this bill is essentially a permissive piece of legislation. It replaces an act that is extraordinarily prescriptive and therefore very inflexible. So as situations change under the current legislation, it's almost impossible to change actions unless one changes the legislation. So the Fire and Emergency New Zealand Bill has been crafted deliberately to be permissive, to enable the new Board of Fire and Emergency New Zealand and Fire and Emergency New Zealand itself to respond more flexibly to situations that arise. And that's a principle that really underpins a lot of the things that people have been talking about this evening. Let me just comment on some of the matters that have been raised. Can I reassure Mr O'Connor that the reference to industry brigades in the bill does include airport fire services? They will still be under the direct control of their relevant airport company, but they are covered by that provision in the legislation. With regard to the issue of permits for fire in open-air pits, a member to my left did observe that there would be mayhem in certain parts of the country if every hanging pit required a permit, but there is the capacity for Fire and Emergency New Zealand to authorise various things or places or areas, if you like, as not being a fire in open air, so that can be dealt with again by the. It seems a bit ironic to be talking about it right at this time, but that can include the fire pits the member was talking about and can address the situation he was referring to. With regard to Mr Farfoy's comments regarding traffic management plans, I know that the Plimmerton Brigade made a submission to the Select Committee about this particular point, and I need to just make a couple of comments in response. Again, I go back to my comments about permissive rather than prescriptive legislation. The issue here is driven largely by workplace health and safety requirements. It's not my view that we need to incorporate an amendment into this bill, but the Fire Service as it stands and the Transport Agency are currently working to deal with some of the issues regarding traffic management plans, how they might be applied to ensure both the safety of road users and firefighters who might be involved in the situations that the member described. So it's not the intention of Fire and Emergency New Zealand to move away from using traffic management plans, but we do want to see developed a better code of practice, if one likes, and I say that with not capitalising those letters, between the NZTA and the Fire and Emergency New Zealand. And we also want to make sure that in doing that we lessen the administrative burden that there currently is on volunteer brigades. I note that the amendment that was proposed wouldn't actually prevent the use of traffic management plans. And so the situation is, I think the point the member raises is a valid one. I don't see it as being appropriate to deal with it under the Act, but it is something that is being dealt with as part of the transition work right now in discussions between Fire and Emergency New Zealand and NZTA. Let me turn to Mr Mitchell's comments regarding fire breaks, particularly clause 58. And I apologise to the member because I came in halfway through his speech, so may not have heard all of it correctly. But as I understand him, the point that he was expressing concern about was the removal of the specific reference to forestry land and the replacement of that with a more general reference to land. I'd make two comments in response. The first is that the reference to forestry land in the current legislation is largely a historical reference, and it doesn't take account of other land areas, for instance, other forms of vegetation than a forest of trees that might be the subject of contention. And so what, again, we're trying to do here is create an overall situation within which there can be flexibility rather than legislate for the highly specific, which then becomes irrelevant once there's a minor change to the circumstance. And I just draw the member's attention to Clause 6, the interpretation clause of the bill, and you'll see there, or the member will see there, that there is a broader definition included of a fire break, which I think covers a much wider range of possibilities. So I understand again the concern that he's raising that we may potentially leave forestry land exposed as a result of these changes. My point in response is to say that when one looks at the breadth of the amendment and looks at it alongside the provision in the interpretation clause, there is protection for them, Mr Chairman.
Well, can't be Mr Whafoi because he's had all his calls, so it better be Ian Lees-Galloway.
You almost make it sound like it's a shame, Mr Chair.
Well,
I thank the, I thank the Minister for his